Hey everyone, it's Horror Free For All, and today I'm bringing you a video that's in conjunction with a past series that I did when I was franchise horror reviews. And this video is going to be centered around the Unmade Tales from the Darkside 2 story segments that were supposed to be in the film, but unfortunately the film never saw the light of day and never got off the ground from concept. The film only ever went as far as picking out which stories. It's even unknown what wraparound segment would have been made for the film. There's no real script for it. The only evidence we have are a few magazine articles from the early 90s that pinpoint certain stories that have been referenced quite frequently on the internet these days. And you can find a bunch of these sources online. Fangoria Magazine's one. I think Bloody Disgusting even made an article about it a couple years back. So, yeah, a lot of people, especially fans of the original Tales from the Darkside TV show and the 1990 film, will tell you that Tales from the Darkside is pretty much a sister product to the Creepshow films that were made in the 1980s. Pretty much the brainchild of George Romero and Stephen King, at least for the first movie, along with Tom Savini's makeup effects, sparked a legacy, and it inspired a second film years later, where George Romero's prodigy, Greg Nicotero, who also worked with Tom Savini and had plenty of experience, got to exercise his creativity in Creepshow 2. Unfortunately, Stephen King was more hands-off in that movie, but that movie had some mild success. And of course, the Tales from the Darkside TV show was coinciding in the 80s around these films. So by the time the Tales from the Darkside happened in 1990, it was already a spiritual successor to the Creepshow series in a lot of ways. But what makes Tales from the Darkside, at least the movies, fascinating is that in the first film, there was a story called The Cat from Hell. And The Cat from Hell, if you've ever seen the original screenplay of Creepshow 2, was supposed to be in that movie. But it was cut out for budgetary reasons, and George Romero saved it for a few years down the line to put into Tales from the Darkside the movie when Tales from the Darkside was greenlit to have a film from Paramount. And because that film made a lot of money and had some success, there was one leftover story from Creepshow 2 that never saw the light of day that George Romero had a lot of passion for, but unfortunately had to cut out or be instrumental in cutting out of the original Creepshow 2 script. And that story was Pinfall. Now, Pinfall is one of the three stories that were supposed to be in Tales from the Darkside 2, along with two other stories. One was written by Robert Bloch, and it is called Almost Human. And I have a book here called Invasion of the Robots that has the story collected in it. It was written in the early 1920s, and it saw a radio play adaptation, and it's been in a couple of different short story collections, anthology collections over the years. But this was one of the stories that were slated for the film. I think they chose Robert Bloch because Robert Bloch's stories were quite prevalent in Tales from the Darkside's TV show, and also a couple of his stories were made into episodes of the sister show to Tales from the Darkside, which was called Monsters. So Robert Bloch, you know, he was a big name around then. I think the Psycho remake happened in 1990. It makes sense to why they would choose one of his stories here. So I was intrigued by this one. And then the last story was probably the newest around that time. Stephen King had put out a original short story into a magazine that ended up getting put in his big collection called Nightmares and Dreamscapes. And the story is called Rainy Season. That was supposed to be the third and final segment of Tales from the Darkside 2. And since I knew what the stories were, all I had to do was get access to read them. Now I have here Nightmares and Dreamscapes, so I had access to Rainy Season. I had access to Almost Human. But unfortunately, because the only physical release of Pinfall out there are like reprop scripts that you can buy for like 25 bucks, or there is a comic version made in like 2016 or 2017 that has original art that basically is just a way to show visually what the story would have looked like, maybe conceptually on paper. And that is so expensive, I just couldn't buy it in time to make this video. But I do have this little German version of Creepshow 2 I'm going to hold up as an example. And if you don't own this Creepshow 2 German version here, it might be worth your time, especially if you like to collect the comics, because there is a adaptation of the wraparound story in a foreign language included inside. So I'll just be using this one as the placeholder for Pinfall. Okay. So I did read Pinfall's script online because scans of the comic were kind of hard to find. So yeah, I had to read the script, but I got the full story out of it, and I was able to read it. Now, in terms of how the movie would have aired the stories, since I don't know the wraparound story, I'm just going to kind of base it off of how they laid out the first film. The first one started with Lot 249, which was a older story. So I started this movie off of my head with Robert Bloch's Almost Human. Now, to give a little plot synopsis, I'm not going to give any major details away in these stories. I want you to go into these blind if you want to try to experience these stories as is. So, yeah, it's going to be mostly spoiler-free. But the gist of the story is this man who is armed with a gun is trying to get into this house of a scientist who has this groundbreaking invention that this man is interested in getting to know or interact with. And we don't know what the invention is early on in the story, but he ends up interacting with the scientist, getting inside of his home, and pretty much forcing him to take him down to wherever he's keeping this groundbreaking invention. And it turns out the invention is this robot who has this sentience to him. He's described as, you know, he has a metal skin. He doesn't really look much like a human, but he's just also described as this being with a mental capacity like a child. And around the beginning of the story, he's like a 6 or 7 year old mentally. And the scientist has been wanting to grow him up privately in an environment to kind of raise him like a kid. And I don't know, I think there's some subtext there, maybe with the scientist being so involved with his work over the years, he never got around to actually procreating and making his own children. So he feels like this is his way to have children. Well, the guy with the gun has ulterior motives with this robot that's hiding in this scientist's basement. And it's revealed that this woman helper that's been helping raise this robot with the scientist was a plant by this man. This woman's his actual girlfriend. And this woman and the robot have this close relationship, but the woman's actually scared of the robot and gets really creeped out by it and says, you know, we shouldn't be messing around with this. But the man is like, you know what? I want him as my get out of jail free card. We need to cut all loose ends we have going on around here. We'll use the robot as pretty much a foolproof plan to be able to start a new life somewhere. And how he does this is he ends up convincing the robot that the scientist is the bad guy and teaches them a bunch of bad practices and pretty much puts a lot of what he's learned street smarts wise into this robot and thinks in advance of all loose ends and possibilities that could thwart his plan. And throughout the rest of the story, he uses this robot to essentially facilitate this plan to take out some of his enemies and the people that know the secret of this robot's existence, to where that once it's all said and done, like I said, he can have this get out of jail free card. But there's a twist involving with the robot and what the robot comes to understand and learn through some really grisly things that the robot does in the story. And I think it would have been really cool to see this on camera in a film setting. And you get this sense that this robot has this urge to want to be like a person, even though he has this understanding that he's not really a real person, but that's something that he strives for, and it plays near the end where you get this really pulp-like story coming to fruition. There's a textbook plot twist involved, a really cool angle that puts some symmetry to the story, and that's essentially what you're going to expect out of Almost Human. Almost Human, at least the way it read, there are some things that you have to kind of look past with the story. There's not a lot of explanation on the origins of the robot. There's not a lot of explanation on this period of time where this man is teaching this robot certain things. I think the book said he was there for like at least a week. So there's a bunch of time skips in the story, but I'd say that those things aren't really important in the grand scheme, but there are some context issues that come from that side effect. But other than that, the story played out very well. It's more of a cautionary tale wholesale in its packaging, teaching children the wrong ways, people or things being products of their environment. Nothing's inherently born evil. Evil is something that's taught. There's a lot of that theming and imagery in this story, and there's a lot of subtext to peel back. All in all, I give this story probably like a 4 out of 5 stars. It's a very solid story. Great way to start off something like this, right? Now, the second story is the one that pretty much ties this movie to the Creepshow franchise, and I picked Pinfall as the second one only because it's more in line with Cat from Hell being the second story in the first Tales from the Darkside movie. I figured, why not have the story linked to Creepshow in the middle to discuss. Now, Pinfall, in a lot of senses, is a very schlocky story, very reminiscent to some early Creepshow stories, like Something to Tide You Over or Father's Day. It's very reminiscent to those stories. But to give you the gist of what the story's about, so these two rival bowling teams are at this bowling alley, and they go there all the time to kind of, just play bowling, kind of recreationally, but kind of seriously. And both of these teams are led by really pompous jerks. One team is called the Regimen, and the others, I think it's like the Bad News Boars. And they're both led by some over-the-top characters that are kind of flanderized, but purposefully here to kind of create some contrast between the two men. And they both have their yes men that pretty much follow them. They have this larger-than-life presence that makes them the leader of both of these bowling teams. And they have this rivalry of sorts going on. Well, it comes to fruition one night while they're at this bowling alley, and there's this old man named McDougal. He has a very memorable name. He's like in his 80s, and he's talking with the guys, and the Ridgy men don't seem to be privy to this old man, but the Bad News Boars kind of make him an honorary team member and have him bowl with them. Well, the old man, he's been bowling for a very long time. He makes a 7-10 split happen, and he has to try to figure out how to make that. He's never made one in his life. But by a series of tragic events, this man gets grisly killed trying to make a 7-10 split, and it ends up working. And everybody's mortified in the situation, but what comes out of it is that this old man ends up being one of the richest people in the whole world. And because he loved bowling so much, and because he loved the bowling alley, he has bequeathed $5 million to the winners of the next bowling tournament that's coming up. So the Ridgy men and the Bad News Boars get to training, and you see a bunch of training montages throughout the story. And it comes to head where the Ridgy men feel like the Bad News Boars are just going to pull ahead of them and pretty much beat them. Because those two teams are the only two teams that really have a good shot of actually winning the $5 million prize pool. So the leader of the Ridgy men decides to do something to the vehicle that pretty much carries all of the bowlers. They all carpool together. They do some tampering to the vehicle, and something may or may not happen to the bowlers of the Bad News Boars. And what ends up happening is, because they're taken out, the Ridgy men now think they have this whole thing in the bag. But because this is written by Stephen King / George Romero, and because this is linked to Creepshow, there is a lot of schlock near the end, and there's a bunch of fun potentially, spoiler free here, killing scenes that you'll see in the story or read about. Depends on which version you pick here. And it ends on that revenge type of story note that Creepshow is known for. And that's essentially what you're going to expect out of Pinfall. Honestly, this story, like I said, it's very schlocky, very reminiscent to that Creepshow 1 style of storytelling. You have this revenge overtone throughout the whole story. You know kind of where it's going because this is kind of formulaic to some other stories we've seen in the franchise so far, and I think that's one of the detracting points to it. But aside from that, I think some of the greatest subtext in here is commentary about greed. There's some elitism. There's cheating to get ahead. There's a lot of simple but yet poignant statements the story is making. Unfortunately, though, I think the execution there's some added elements I wish were in the story that just weren't there to kind of make the story a little more deep than superficial at times. I feel like the time skips is partly due to planning a time crunch, but I also think there's some negatives involved with that because the dynamic between these two teams, you get that sense of it early on in the story, but you don't really get that sense of it in the middle portion. I feel like maybe if they adapted it on screen, maybe they would have fleshed out some other elements to it. I couldn't tell you because we never got it, but as is, based on the story that I got from the script alone, I like the writing to it. I like some of the characters. Just wish there was more to it. It just feels like there's something missing there, like a good ingredient to kind of make it pop. But I ended up giving this one a similar score to something like Father's Day or The Hitchhiker. And I gave this like a 3.75 out of 5. This one's a slightly above average story. Could have been way better than what it was, but I really enjoyed it. Now, the last story is, of course, Rainy Season by Stephen King. Now, this one, I chose to be the last one because it feels like this would have been a finale story, inherently, and plus, it's the only other one to really pick, so that's why it ends here. But this story was probably my favorite out of the bunch. It's definitely leaning towards that wild Stephen King storytelling that he's known for in his short stories. There's some creativity here. There's a good atmosphere and setting. And the characters were written in an intriguing way. And I definitely think that in terms of writing, from the ones I read, this one was the most engaging and the most intriguing to me. But the story is simple. These two people, they're a couple, have decided to take a vacation to this secluded town in Maine. I think it's called Willow, Maine. And the two of them are just looking for a romantic getaway to escape the hustle and bustle of their everyday lives. And they end up in this small town, but discover quite quickly that there's no real tourism destination in this place. The place that they decided to rent, I guess, sounded better on paper when they were researching where to book or something. And they're kind of thrown back by this, and they don't really know what to make of it. But they try to make the best of it and interact with some locals that are in this very small town. And these locals essentially tell them that there's this rainy season coming ahead, and that the two of them should get out of town while they can, and the two try to warn them. But the couple's like, you guys are just messing with us. There's no such thing as what you're saying is happening. And I don't really want to spoil it, but it's essentially involving these killer toads that may or may not rain from the sky, okay? So the couple, they head off to their lodge that they've rented, and they, got some groceries. They're, preparing to stay here for a little while, but they can't really escape that story that was, put out there in the ether. And the two of them kind of bicker with each other, and they don't really know what to do in the situation. One of them's not really happy. One of them's trying to make the best of it. But it all comes to fold when the rain actually starts. And these toads may or may not start raining from the sky. And it becomes pretty much a night of survival for this couple who have to struggle with going through different parts of the house as these toads may or may not be coming through the doors and trying to get them and swallow them whole. They end up getting pretty much annexed to one part of the house where they think they're safe, but something potentially tragic happens, and it happens off page. We never really get to see what happens to them, but it's described by King in a mild, grisly fashion that you can put to your own imagination of what happened to this couple. And the story ends off with like a somber note, and there's a recontextualization bit from the couple early on in the story that maybe has to deal with like an omen, or this is a necessity to do, like this is a bad thing, but this is something that's unavoidable, and it is what it is. And that's essentially what you'll expect out of Rainy Season as a whole. Now, Rainy Season is a lot more cut and dry than the other stories that I've talked about so far, but I do think that this one would have been a fun little character study, especially with the couple, because majority of the story takes place from the couple's point of view while they're inside of this house preparing for this potential rain to come that they keep hearing about. And I think that would have made some good tension on screen. There are some red herring points in the story that I think really work. My only real negative complaint about this story is the lack of context behind this omen of this thing called Rainy Season, which happens every 7 years, and these toads may or may not fall out of the sky, and the implications with all that. It's kind of explained, but not really. There's some missing context that can kind of help bridge the gap of logic in the story. But aside from that issue, everything else is poignantly done. I think the suspense is there. I think the creativity's there. This would have been a really fun one to watch. Now, I struggled with this one basing everything I was given just by reading the story, because on one hand, it has great atmosphere, it has great prowess, it has great written characters, it has an intriguing story, but trying to imagine this on screen, apparently there are some short film adaptations of this story, I just haven't watched them. It might be kind of monotonous to adapt this straightforward, or it will go into the route where it might be a little too hokey. And I can definitely see this is the type of story, if it had bad acting in it, it could take away from the whole story completely. But if I was going to be, a fair person, imagine that they got the acting down right, they got the setting down right, they had a good set going, a good design for the toads, this one would have landed higher, right? It's kind of like how I would think of something like Something to Tide You Over With, from the first Creepshow movie. Because of the acting and because of the setting and how like captivating this stuff is featured on camera, it makes the story a lot more pluggable for me. As if I was just reading the story, I would put it way lower. You know what I mean? But, I feel like this is kind of like an inversion of that. But honestly, just basing it off the written version here, I had a blast with this story. I'd probably give it a 4.75 out of 5, but that's with an asterisk. That's given that if this was given a movie adaptation, that it would be firing on all cylinders. Okay? So all in all, my thoughts on the segments of Tales from the Darkside 2, the movie that never got made for the film that, of course, was never made. Honestly, this one would have been a solid movie. I think if we just got the adaptation straightforward with great effects, great setting, great set pieces, great acting, and it was like pretty much word for word just adapted onto screen here, I think this one would have been a notch above Creepshow 2, but a notch below the original Tales from the Darkside movie. But it's still in that same category of greatness that Creepshow 1, Creepshow 2, and Tales from the Darkside the movie had. I think my least favorite was Pinfall, and I think that's more to do with the time skips and the lack of context. But it's definitely the most schlockiest story. It's probably the most violent, and I can see some people saying it's the most fun. I like it. It has some simple subtext to it, a couple of superficial layers to peel back, but nothing too deep. It's a fine enough one for what it is. All right, and that one, like I said, is Pinfall. The second story is Almost Human. That would be my number 2. I think this would have been a great story to start off with. Like the whole angle of being a product of the environment, or nothing is inherently born evil. Evil is something that's taught. I think is a great message for the story. And seeing this robot on screen, at least with the short story's depiction of some kills, would have been kind of fun to see. It wouldn't have been as hokey as something like Lot 249 with a mummy going around being like a slasher or anything, but it would have been unnerving. And if they made the robot creepy, this one might have scored actually higher, but I can't really imagine them doing all that creepy of a robot job. I've never really been creeped out by robots, unfortunately, but who knows? They could have potentially had like a home run cast for this segment and just made it a lot better in presentation than the short story was. But there are some issues given the background of the robot, the background of the scientists. There's some exposition and some context missing from the story to make it feel whole. But like I said, none of those issues really amount to much because they're not really all that important. But I wish it was there. And I do like the robot kind of warming up to wanting to be a human. I like that angle in there. But it's a good story. You know, I think Pinfall is slightly above average. This one's the good one. But the standout would have been Rainy Season. For sure. Rainy Season would have been probably the most fun one. Now, if it had, like I said, if it had bad acting, it probably won't land as well. And it might, if that would have happened and this segment existed and it was bad acting or something, or a bad set, or didn't capture the atmosphere all that well, this one probably would be last. It very well could have been that case. But the short story itself, I love it as a character study. I love the omen nature to it, the unavoidable horror that's going to come to this couple. There's something about it that's just genuinely tense. It's like the calm before the storm, where you're witnessing the calm, and you know it's going to happen, but you don't know what point of the story it's going to start happening. And when it does start, it's pretty much like a creature feature survival type movie, or a creature feature survival type short story, or, you know, comic segment that you'll see in like EC Comics back in the day. It feels very much in the vein of that, and I love the creativity to it. This one to me is a very exceptional one. It would honestly, stock with just a short story itself would be my number 3 behind Lover's Vow in the Crate. But like I said, I don't have a visual representation of the story to base it off. I just have the written portion here. But yeah, if you are interested in reading these stories from Tales from the Darkside's 2's long lost adaptation list, I'd give them a recommendation. Totally would recommend that you go read these stories to kind of get an idea maybe of what the stories might have looked like in the film. Especially if you're a diehard Creepshow fan like me, Pinfall is a must-read. And it's a very well-known story associated with the Creepshow franchise that a lot of fans for years have been clamoring for to get made in some capacity, maybe in the TV show or in like a Creepshow remake of some sort if they ever wanted to remake the movies or something. I love that Pinfall connects this movie, or would have been movie, into the Creepshow franchise like Cat from Hell did with Tales from the Darkside 1, the movie, and made this franchise that started in 1982 more of like a 4-film franchise. I know Creepshow 3 exists, and that would have been technically the 5th film, but Creepshow 3 is a abomination and a hot piece of stinking shit, and I would much rather have a universe where this movie got made than ever seeing Creepshow 3 ever see the light of day. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the Tales from the Darkside 2 stories. If you get around to reading these, let me know your thoughts on these down in the comment section. Which one's your favorite? Which one's your least favorite? Do you like them all evenly? Do you not like any of them? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.